Rajarshi as well, but Professor Rajarshi is more in the political economy kind of domain. But I mean, I have made a promise to myself, and let's see if we can keep it, which is to invite Satyendra before too long to speak at the center. So I'll try and make amends for cutting him short today. Now, reading Sushmita's book, and I think I now have read for roughly around 1.5 times. I started reading it again, and I hadn't been able to finish the reading of the book. But again, several things that struck me, and I also wanted to say certain things that are different from another previous occasion when I had the chance of discussing her book, is the interdisciplinarity that's there very strongly in the book. And following the vein of the discussion of Satyendra, I think Sushmita's book is a work coming from a political scientist, very much unlike the scholarship that is conventionally produced by political scientists. It draws very strongly on history, anthropology, and economics. Usually we political scientists, we draw upon sociology a lot, and there are some, of course, outstanding and exceptional political scientists who manage to do this interdisciplinary kind of work, but I'm very, very pleasantly surprised to find that Sushmita has done such a thing. And very briefly, because I would very much welcome a discussion, question and answer session between you and the panel here, including Sushmita. So I'll make just 3 points, and in keeping with the spirit of interdisciplinarity, I'll say that I would like to begin with a certain theorization by more of a literary critique, let's say, or a literary theorist, Jacques Rancière, who talks about something called the partition of senses. Okay? It's a very, very interesting conceptualization and formulation, which basically means that there is a wall, let's say, between the seeable and the non-seeable, between the sayable and the unsayable. Okay, a society is made of such kind of partitions. So we see something. This means that we see something every day, but we at the same time cannot see certain elements, certain aspects of what we see every day. A very simple example would be when we look at, let us say, very few of us, for that matter, I think, manage to see the mess workers and the sanitation workers who work in our hostel. Those of us who even look at them and kind of seriously and take notice of them, do not see that they are the inhabitants of places like Kusumpur Pahari right across the campus, and they tend to come from particular caste background and so on and so forth. So we see them, but at the same time we cannot see them, we do not see them. And the great thing about such work as Sushmita's is that it manages to break down these partitions and make us see things that we are not used to seeing. I was planning to surprise you with one such kind of partition, but Satyendra spoiled it for me, which is the distinction between city and village that we are, habituated in making. So, choosing something like Munirka or Shahpur Jat or the other spaces that Sushmita has worked on in her book, actually messes up this distinction between city and village, between what is urban and what is, let us say, rural, so to speak. We all know that villages are also changing, and so are cities, but we fail to capture the manner in which the changes are kind of blurring the distinction between the two in some sense. And the other is, of course, community and capital. We are more used to thinking, in keeping with the modernization cases, that as capital comes to town, communities begin to get destroyed, and we turn into individuals in some sense. But Sushmita manages to show that it is precisely, to use a word that she so resonantly uses in the book, bhaichara or community ties, kinship ties, that become the new kind of carrier, that becomes the new kind of receptacle for capital accumulation. Okay, so staying, let us say, for example, a jat, very much embedded in one's biradari also helps one to become a successful capitalist of sorts. Okay, so that's one point that, and I think Satyendra's work is full of these kinds of brilliant insights gleaned from the field, where an immersion into the field, an immersion in the material of the field helps us to upset all the kind of established binaries and partitioned kind of categories which we otherwise tend to believe in when we start from the theoretical framework. Okay, so it's a very refreshing call to, in some sense, junk theoretical frameworks and to kind of commit ourselves to the field at some level, and then kind of from the field and from our immersion in the materials, kind of trying to return to how to construct a theoretical structure from the material. The second point that I wanted to highlight in Sushmita's work is this. Sushmita herself has also spoken, she's just spoken of ethnography, but I would want to kind of go a little further and say that this is also a very, very heartening sign for someone like me to notice that political science is beginning to broach, beginning to get into techniques, methods, insights and theories from anthropology, borrowing a whole lot of methodological insights from anthropology. We are actually now beginning to consider, in some sense, the humanness of the people that we are looking at, behind our template of political actors. Okay, and that leads us to a wealth of observations, deep, kind of profound insights that we gain from a kind of participant observation, which we are not used to in political science. I mean, we very often think that we can parachute into a context with a questionnaire, with a survey sort of a thing in hand, and then we come away with the data, and then we get what is happening in the field. But it's actually far from that. And borrowing and learning from anthropology, among other disciplines of course, but from anthropology, is really, really enriching. And how enriching it can be, I think both Sushmita and Satyendra's work are sources to learn how do we combine techniques of anthropology, insights from anthropology to do our work in political science. How do we develop a more ground up, a more granular kind of understanding of how power functions, even if we are only interested in the question of power, or in this case, capital. So that's the other thing that, and for that, again, a technique that they share in common, and I would think that Rajarshi is also favorably inclined to, is to catch hold of the terms that are used on the ground in the local language. Okay, and to get the peculiarity of the sense in which those terms are used before we get impatient to translate these terms into profit or capital or power or obligation or authority, so on and so forth. We are far too habituated in kind of using these kind of terms, received terms, and we try to foist them on the lives that people live. But people kind of live their lives, and they use very different kind of terms for a particular reason, because they have very different, subtle but significantly different kind of senses with which these terms are actually loaded. So we should become very attentive, and when we go to the field, what this teaches us is that we should listen to the language in which people speak to each other, in which people communicate. This is of kind of prime importance, absolute importance. And since I don't want to keep dragging this on, especially after listening to Sushmita and Satyendra, I don't really have a lot to contribute here. I'll just make a third concluding point, which segues back to the doubt that Sushmita was raising about what can the global south speak to the global north through these kind of work. Are we simply talking about something which needs to be delimited by a certain kind of perimeter of coming from the global south, or a vernacular kind of a context, or as Satyendra has said, that why do we need to kind of pay obeisance to these kinds of caste of categories in some sense, the caste hierarchy of categories. Do we need to kind of think of ourselves, imagine of ourselves, and imagine our work in these terms at all? Here, I do feel very strongly inclined to agree with the proposition that Satyendra has made, that perhaps, all over the world, all across the world, a characteristics of late neoliberal capitalism is that capital is turning into rent. Okay? That rent could actually be a more expansive explanatory category than perhaps the sense in which we have been using the word capital here. And to the extent that in terms of analytical explanation, we probably can begin to use rent to displace the primacy of capital in the conceptual sense that capital contains. And I have, in support of this argument, the observations of somebody from a very different context, from someone who is immersed in the Greek experience, has been part of the Syriza and the Podemos party, an economist as well as politician called Yanis Varoufakis, who has come out with a very exciting work called Techno-Feudalism, where he is actually making the case of looking at rent as the more dominant category than that of capital. So I would really invite Sushmita to think more about the capaciousness of rent as a category, as a category, instead of beating our heads against the wall of capital. Thank you. So that's all that I had to say.